The economic crisis and the climate crisis are in fact intertwined in more than one way. Our nation faces three crises simultaneously. The economic crisis has two parts, the credit crisis and the global synchronized recession. Both unusual. Credit crises are not that unusual, but the breadth and depth of this recession is quite unusual. The second crisis is a national security crisis, and without in any way trying to reopen the long, difficult debate over the war in Iraq, I really don't want to open. I happen to believe it was a mistake, but my point in mentioning it is that whether you were for it or against it, I think we can all agree that among the reasons we went to war in Iraq, at least one of those reasons was connected to the fact that our nation has a very heavy dependence on oil, and the largest recoverable reserves by far are in the Persian Gulf, and twice in a little more than a decade we have been drawn into military conflicts there. And then the third crisis is the one I'm going to talk about today, the climate crisis. But just a word about the first two. The credit crisis was detonated, if you will. Some explosions require an initial detonation and then a larger one to follow. And the detonator of this one was the subprime mortgage crisis. And to recap, when Tipper and I got our first mortgage, we had to show proof that we could pay the mortgage and make a down payment. And I sort of thought that was the way it still was, but I was among many who found out to my surprise that the rules had changed, and the evident risk without having a down payment or proof of an ability to pay the regular payments, that risk was seen to be washed out by securitizing these subprime mortgages and selling them into the global market. We've all heard the saying that there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Perhaps on that list of top 10 most powerful things, you would also put the destructive power of an assumption whose time has suddenly passed. And the assumption that there was no risk in these subprime mortgages suddenly collapsed, and the crisis of confidence in the credit markets spread rapidly. We now have $7 trillion worth of subprime carbon assets, whose value is based on the assumption that it's perfectly all right to put 70 million tons of global warming pollution into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet. And that assumption is in the process of collapsing. We are now making the beginnings of a shift away from carbon-based fuels. And of course, the urgent question is how quickly we can make that shift, how quickly we can stop deforestation and introduce much higher levels of efficiency and conservation, the easiest ways to reduce global warming pollution, and shift to renewable sources of energy. But the second part of the economic crisis is the synchronized global recession. And typically a recession is combated by the economic policymakers with a combination of monetary policy, including the tools available to the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy or budget policy. And since interest rates are nearly zero, the tools in the monetary toolbox are not particularly useful. And the burden falls upon fiscal policy, and that's why we've had all the focus on a stimulus to try to restore economic robustness. And we need a global synchronized stimulus. And of course, the United States is the only nation that can truly lead the world in a matter of this kind. And forgive me if that sounds chauvinistic as an American. Let me turn off my iPhone. If y'all haven't switched to iPhones yet, you should. Sorry to throw a commercial in there. Didn't mean to. So the United States is trying to lead with a large stimulus. And since we have to have a stimulus, it makes sense to take this occasion as an opportunity to really start making this big shift. In other words, all three of these crises, economic, national security, and climate, have a common thread running through them. And when you grab hold of that common thread, which is our absurd overdependence on carbon-based fuels, and pull on it, all three of these crises can begin to unravel. And we hold in our hands the answer, which is this generational one-off investment to switch from an energy infrastructure that's based on expensive, dirty, and vulnerable fuels based on carbon, and shift instead to an infrastructure that's based on fuels that are free from the sun and the wind and geothermal sources, efficiency and science, innovation and ingenuity. I've heard a lot of great comments about Jim's speech last night and his words about how Lincoln had this great grasp of science. And may I say that I join with this organization in welcoming, among the many transitions that we've seen in the last 2 months, the transition to a president who really appreciates and honors science and is giving it an appropriate